When Maya Kruse woke up that morning, stomach pains doubling her over in agony, she couldn't have known this was the price of her courage, the physical cost of carrying a secret that could save dozens of families or permanently destroy her own life. The 38-year-old chef had spent months operating in the shadows, investigating a betrayal so ruthless it threatened to take the job of her mother, Dolores, and every other worker at the textile mill where Dolores had dedicated 40 years of her life. Now her body was demanding payment for the silent battle she was fighting, a battle nobody knew about. But what Maya didn't realize was that Elias Thornsey, the 52-year-old CEO she had worked for 3 years, was about to discover everything. This discovery would change not only the company's fate, but permanently transform two lives that seemed destined never to truly intersect. This is the true story of how a simple chef saved a businessman from losing everything, but not in the way you imagine. Because sometimes what we most need saving from is not financial ruin, but ourselves, and the blindness that prevents us from seeing the value in the people right in front of us. Stay until the end and discover how an ordinary woman, armed only with courage and old notebooks, faced betrayal, prejudice, and her own insecurity to prove that heroism doesn't need a cape or a title, only a heart willing to do what is right, even when the whole world tells you to stay in your lane. The aroma of fresh coffee hadn't yet begun to permeate the air when Elias Thorne opened his eyes that August morning. At 52, the CEO rarely woke before 6, but something pulled him from bed at 5:15, an inexplicable unease that drove him down the wide wooden staircase of his spacious home in the Maples, Kingsport, North Carolina, an old textile town where traditional mills still stubbornly resisted the passage of time. The pre-dawn silence was thick, almost palpable, and Elias felt every step creak under his bare feet as he walked toward the kitchen, guided only by the faint light coming from the hall. It was then that muffled cries shattered the stillness of the house, sounds that seemed to come from far away and very close at the same time, echoing off the white walls and making Elias's heart accelerate uncomfortably. The storage room door was ajar, and through it escaped a weak light that danced in the shadows. Elias shoved the door open, the cold metal of the knob burning his sweaty palm, and the scene that revealed itself before him froze his movements for complete seconds that felt like an eternity. Maya Kruse, his 38-year-old chef who had worked for him for 3 years, was kneeling on the cold tile floor, surrounded by dozens of old notebooks scattered in a semicircle around her, yellowed photographs covering every free inch of the floor. Her hands were trembling violently as she frantically scribbled something on a piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. Tears streamed down her face without any effort to contain them, staining the open pages before her, and the sobs escaping her throat were the most desperate sound Elias had ever heard. The CEO stood motionless in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the scene before him as Maya lifted her face, her red, swollen eyes meeting his with a mixture of terror and determination that confused him further. Elias, a man accustomed to having control over every situation, felt impatience climb up his throat like bitter bile, and his voice came out harsher than he intended when he demanded immediate explanations, every word loaded with the authority of someone who never needed to ask twice. Maya wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving damp streaks on her cheeks, and began collecting the papers with frantic movements, quickly storing everything in a dark wooden box he had never seen before, her fingers fumbling with the tiny padlock trembling in her hands. The only answer he received was a whispered plea to trust her, words so low that Elias had to lean in to hear them fully, and the frustration that overcame him was so intense that he felt his temples throb. Maya stood up with difficulty, hugging the box against her chest as if protecting something more precious than life itself, and walked past him out of the storage room without looking back, leaving only the smell of old paper and salty tears in the air. Elias stood there for long minutes after she disappeared upstairs, staring at the now empty floor, where moments before lay a chaos of memories that did not belong to him, and for the first time in many years he felt completely lost inside his own home. The days that followed were marked by a silent tension that hung over the residence like a storm cloud about to break. Maya arrived earlier and earlier, sometimes before the sun rose, and Elias watched her from his bedroom window as she entered through the back door with tired steps that seemed to drag the weight of the world. The deep circles under her eyes told stories of sleepless nights, and her hands trembled noticeably when she prepared breakfast, spilling dark drops onto the granite countertop that she had to clean 3 times before serving the steaming cup. The CEO didn't mention the incident in the storage room, but he couldn't stop observing her, driven by an uncomfortable curiosity that grew daily like an invasive plant taking over an abandoned garden. Elias's artisanal textile mill was a 20-minute drive from his house, a brick building that breathed history through every dusty window and every antique loom still operating with decades-old precision. But in those August days, the atmosphere inside the factory was as heavy as that of his home, and the CEO felt the tightness in his chest every time he crossed the main gate and saw the worried faces of the employees who worked there, some longer than he himself had been alive. Julian Albright, his 49-year-old partner, had begun an aggressive campaign for modernization, talking about automation and efficiency with a glint in his eye that Elias recognized as pure, unbridled ambition, the kind of ambition that didn't measure consequences or consider the people who would be left behind. The meetings between the two partners had become verbal battlegrounds, with Julian Kios presenting spreadsheets and projections showing cold, impersonal numbers, while Elias tried to defend the traditional weavers who gave soul to the artisanal fabrics sold across the state. Among these workers was Dolores Cruz, Maya's mother, a 61-year-old woman whose calloused hands knew every thread and pattern of those looms like a mother knows her child's face. Elias saw Dolores every day when he walked through the main hall, and the woman always offered him a tired but genuine smile, unaware that her 40-year job hung by a thread as fragile as those she wove with such mastery. It was in the second week after the storage room incident that Elias began to notice subtle changes in Maya's behavior that went beyond tiredness and dark circles. The chef started asking seemingly innocent questions during breakfast, inquiries about the mill and its processes that felt too casual to be truly casual. Elias answered mechanically while his mind worked to understand what was happening. She asked about suppliers with a forced curiosity, about contracts with an interest that didn't suit someone who spent her days among pots and spices, and the CEO sensed something larger unfolding in the shadows, something he couldn't fully grasp. What Elias didn't know was that Maya had spent the last few weeks investigating the company on her own, motivated by a conversation she had with her mother 3 months earlier, when Dolores mentioned irregularities in the new contracts Julian was preparing for the longest-tenured employees. The chef, who loved her mother with an intensity that ached in her chest, had started paying attention to details that previously went unnoticed, discreetly copying documents she saw on Elias's office table when serving dinners and parties at his house, taking advantage of every moment he was distracted to photograph papers, with her old cell phone that barely worked, but still served the purpose. Maya's nights in the storage room were not moments of madness or meaningless despair, but intense analysis sessions where she compared numbers, looked for patterns, and tried to understand the complex language of business that had never been part of her world. She had begun assembling a puzzle whose pieces were scattered among invoices, contracts, and printed emails, and every new discovery brought her closer to a truth that terrified her as much as it compelled her to continue. The notebooks Elias had seen scattered on the floor were meticulous records of everything she had found, written in shaky but determined handwriting, and the wooden box held secrets that could change the fate of many people, including the CEO himself. Elias hadn't slept well for weeks, waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something crucial was slipping out of his control, and the factory accounts showed increasingly worrying numbers that didn't fully track when he tried to trace them back to their source. Julian insisted the problems were the result of a lack of modernization, that the costs of skilled labor were draining the company's resources, but there was something in the way he presented these arguments that deeply bothered Elias, an excessive confidence that seemed to hide information the partner preferred to keep to himself. The CEO began reviewing old documents, searching for answers he didn't know how to formulate into questions, and the more he searched, the more he felt he was walking through a maze where all the walls looked the same. It was on a September afternoon, as the first signs of early autumn appeared. that Elias finally found the first concrete clue that something was profoundly wrong. An invoice from a supplier he didn't recognize, with values that seemed too inflated for the material described. When he tried to track down the company, he discovered the listed address was a vacant lot on the other side of town. His heart pounded as he searched for more similar documents, finding 3, then 5, then a dozen transactions with phantom suppliers that were bleeding money from the company like invisible leeches, sucking life from a sick body. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless as he sank heavily into his leather chair, the office spinning slightly around him. Julian was siphoning resources from the company, using money that should have been strengthening the business to pad it with fake debts, creating a situation where the mill would appear on the verge of bankruptcy when it was, in fact, being systematically looted from within. And the goal was too obvious for Elias to ignore. When the company looked unsalvageable, Julian would offer to buy his share for a fraction of the real value, assuming total control of a business that would become profitable again once he stopped draining the resources. But Elias didn't have enough proof to confront his partner, only suspicions and a few invoices that Julian could easily justify as administrative errors or third-party mismanagement. The CEO felt a sense of powerlessness he had never experienced before, trapped within his own company by someone he had trusted for years. The frustration that overcame him was so intense that he had to leave the office and walk through the factory corridors just to keep from shouting in anger. It was during this aimless walk that he passed the weaving section and saw Dolores working at her loom, her hands moving with a precision that came from decades of practice, and something tightened in his chest at the thought that this woman and so many others would lose everything because of one man's greed. Maya watched Elias with increasing attention, noticing the changes in his behavior, the prolonged silences during meals where there had previously been superficial conversations about the weather or local events. She saw the weight he carried on his shoulders, the way he looked at his plate without really seeing the food, and she knew he was beginning to unearth the same truth she had been digging up for months. The chef fought with herself daily, torn between the fear of exposure and the need to help, between the safety of remaining invisible and the desire to make a difference, and every day that passed without her making a decision weighed on her conscience like stones accumulated in a backpack that grew heavier with every dawn. It was late on a Thursday night, after Elias had gone upstairs with steps heavier than usual, that Maya finally made her decision. She went down to the storage room, opened the wooden box with hands that trembled so violently she needed 3 attempts to fit the key into the tiny padlock, and looked at all the documents she had gathered over months of silent investigation. Everything was there: copies of invoices, photographs of emails, transaction records that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Julian was systematically robbing the company. Maya knew the moment had come to reveal what she had uncovered, even if it meant exposing herself in a way that terrified her to the bone, even if it forever changed the dynamic of her relationship with Elias and jeopardized the only stable job she had managed to hold for more than a year. The next morning, when Elias came down for coffee, he found Maya waiting for him in the kitchen, with the wooden box on the table, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination that stopped him in the doorway. The box seemed to pulse with a life of its own on the granite countertop, and Elias felt his legs weaken as he walked slowly toward his chair, each step echoing in the heavy silence of the kitchen. Maya remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her body in a gesture that blended nervousness and resolve. When she began to speak, her voice came out steadier than she expected, carrying the weight of months of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. She told him about the conversation with her mother, about the irregularities Dolores had mentioned in the contracts, about how much it had bothered her, so much that she couldn't simply ignore it and move on as a sensible person would have done. Elias listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the box. When Maya finally opened it, revealing organized stacks of copied documents, photographs of emails and notebooks filled with notes in her shaky handwriting, the CEO felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of revelations that left Elias stunned, each new document Maya showed adding another layer to Julian's betrayal. She had organized everything meticulously, separating the evidence by category and date, showing a clear pattern of embezzlement that had begun almost a year prior and had only escalated over time. There were invoices from shell companies that didn't exist, transfers to corporate accounts that led to dead ends, and contracts signed on behalf of the mill for services never rendered. The more Elias saw, the more his rage grew, mixed with a reluctant admiration for the woman he had always considered just his chef. Maya explained each document with a clarity that showed how long she had spent studying those papers, connecting dots that he himself, with all his business experience, had taken weeks to even begin to notice. When she finished, the silence that fell over the kitchen was so dense it seemed to suck the air out of the room. Elias put his head in his hands, elbows on the table, and Maya saw his shoulders tremble in a way that made her question whether he was crying or just trying to contain the fury she could feel emanating from him in almost palpable waves. The CEO finally lifted his face. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from a contained rage she had never seen in anyone. He asked why she had done it, why she had risked so much for something that wasn't her problem. Maya's answer came in a whisper charged with emotion. Because her mother had worked 40 years at that mill, because those people were her family as much as they were his employees, and because she couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen right under her nose without at least trying to do something about it. Trust between them wasn't established in that moment, but it began to be built there, brick by brick, on a foundation that would take months to fully solidify. Elias asked Maya to keep everything in absolute secrecy, and in the days that followed, they began working together discreetly, meeting in the early hours of the morning before anyone else in the house woke up. The chef taught the CEO to pay attention to details he had always ignored, showing him how names suspiciously repeated on invoices, how rounded figures were a clear sign of manipulation. Elias absorbed every lesson with a humility that stung his pride, but which he knew was necessary. He began to see Maya through different eyes, no longer as the employee who prepared his meals, but as an unexpected ally whose intelligence and dedication were saving everything he had built over decades. But the more Elias understood the extent of Julian's treachery, the more his internal conflict intensified in ways he didn't expect. The CEO was a man of appearances, someone who always cared about what others thought, about maintaining an image of control and competence among the Kingsport elite. The idea of exposing that he had entrusted a crucial investigation to his chef instead of hiring qualified professionals wounded his pride in ways that shamed him. He caught himself imagining the conversations at the country clubs, the veiled comments at boardroom meetings, the way he would be seen as weak or incompetent for needing the help of someone society considered lower in status. This conflict consumed him during the day, making him question every decision, every step he took toward confronting Julian. Maya could see the internal struggle reflected on his face every morning when he came down for their secret meetings. Julian, for his part, continued his modernization campaign with renewed vigor, presenting increasingly aggressive proposals at board meetings. He spoke of reducing the workforce by 40%, replacing the traditional weavers with imported automatic machinery that would cost a fortune, but which, according to his elaborate spreadsheets, would pay for itself in less than 2 years. The longest-tenured employees lived in a constant state of anxiety, whispering in the hallways about imminent layoffs, and Dolores came home every day with a wearier face, sharing with Maya her fears of losing the job that was everything she knew. The chef listened to her mother in silence, hugging her while feeling the pressure mount inside, knowing she held the evidence that could save all those jobs, but unable to reveal anything yet. In October, during the traditional Kingsport Heritage Gala weekend that brought the town's elite together, Julian Bahau made his final move. He invited Elias Guim to dinner at one of the most exclusive downtown restaurants, and there, amidst sophisticated dishes neither of them truly touched, he presented his final offer. He would buy Elias's share of the company for less than a third of its actual value, arguing that the mill was on the verge of collapse, and this was Elias's only chance to walk away with any money before everything completely imploded. The partner had documents prepared, numbers supporting his narrative of crisis, and scheduled a meeting with lawyers for the following week, giving Elias 7 days to make the most important decision of his business life. Elias left that dinner feeling the weight of the world crushing his shoulders. When he arrived home, he found Maya still awake in the kitchen, preparing bread for the next day. He sank into a chair without saying a word, and she immediately sensed that something terrible had happened by the way he held his head in his hands, by the deep sighs escaping his chest. The chef washed her hands, dried them on her apron, and sat across from him, waiting patiently until he found the words to describe the abyss opening before him. When Elias finally told her about Julian's proposal, the tight deadline, and the feeling of being cornered without escape, Maya felt her own throat tighten with emotion. For the first time since starting the investigation, she allowed herself to cry in front of him, not out of despair but out of frustration at having all the proof yet being unable to prevent the suffering she saw etched on the CEO's face. It was that night that Maya made another decision that would change the course of everything. She revealed to Elias that she had more than just copied documents. In the last few weeks, she had obtained something even more valuable, an audio recording of Julian discussing the embezzlement with an accomplice over the phone. She had captured the conversation accidentally using the old cell phone Elias had given her months earlier for emergencies. The recording happened during a dinner she served at the house, when Julian took a call and stepped out onto the patio, thinking he was far enough away not to be overheard, unaware that Maya had left the phone recording near the open window while clearing plates in the dining room. The audio was clear enough to leave no doubt about the criminal intentions, the amounts siphoned, and the plan to take over the company after forcing Elias to sell it for nothing. The revelation left Elias paralyzed for long seconds. When he finally reacted, it was to question whether Maya understood the risk she had taken, the danger of being discovered making that recording. But the chef merely shook her head, explaining that some things were too important to let fear win, that her mother and all the other workers depended on that mill to survive, and if she had to risk her job and her safety to protect them, then it was a risk worth taking. Her words touched something deep within Elias, something that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. The sense of responsibility, not just for profits and numbers, but for the real people whose lives depended on his business decisions. The days leading up to the lawyers' meeting were the tensest Elias had experienced in his entire career. He reviewed the evidence constantly, mentally rehearsing how he would confront Julian, but every time he considered making everything public, his stomach churned with anxiety. The CEO discreetly consulted 2 different attorneys without revealing all the details just to understand his legal options. Both confirmed that the evidence Maya had gathered was solid enough not only to expel Julian from the partnership, but also to pursue criminal charges for the embezzlement. But Elias hesitated, caught between doing the right thing and protecting his reputation, between justice and appearances. This indecision consumed him from the inside out like an emotional cancer. Maya, observing Elias's suffering, began to question if she had made the right choice by getting involved. She spent nights awake, tossing and turning in the small bed of her modest room, thinking of all the ways this could go wrong, how she could lose her job and be unable to pay the medical bills for her mother, Dolores, who suffered from severe arthritis in her hands from decades of work on the looms. The stress began to take its physical toll. 3 days before the scheduled meeting, Maya woke up with a searing pain in her stomach that left her doubled over in agony, unable to get out of bed. Dolores found her that way when she came to visit in the late afternoon and immediately called a doctor who diagnosed severe nervous gastritis, prescribing absolute rest and strong medication that left Maya dizzy and confused. Maya's absence forced Elias to do something he hadn't done in decades: cook for himself. The CEO stood in the empty kitchen that first morning, looking at the cabinets and pots as if they were alien objects, with no idea where to start. He burned the first egg he tried to fry, spilled milk trying to make coffee, and cut his finger peeling a potato so disastrously that he needed 3 bandages to stop the bleeding. But as he struggled with tasks that Maya performed with ease every day, something began to shift inside him, a visceral understanding of the value of manual labor, of the silent dedication of people doing essential things without recognition or admiration. Elias thought of Maya spending nights in the storage room, investigating documents after spending all day cooking, and for the first time, he truly grasped the magnitude of the sacrifice she had made for people who didn't even know they were being saved. On the 5th day of Maya's absence, Elias couldn't stand it anymore and went to visit her at her modest home on the outskirts of town, a place he had never visited despite her working for him for 3 years. The house was small but impeccably clean, with old but well-maintained furniture. Dolores greeted him with evident surprise, offering coffee, which he accepted more out of politeness than desire. Maya was lying on the living room sofa, pale and visibly thinner, and when her eyes met Elias's he saw an exhaustion in them that went far beyond the physical. She tried to sit up, but he gestured for her to remain lying down, and he sat in the wooden chair beside the sofa, feeling displaced in the simple but welcoming environment that sharply contrasted with the empty luxury of his own home. They talked for almost an hour, and Maya, weakened by illness and medication, revealed things she would never have had the courage to say under normal circumstances. She spoke about how many times she had almost given up the investigation, about the nights she cried in fear of being discovered, about the guilt she felt for hiding everything from her mother, Dolores, who noticed her exhaustion but didn't understand the cause. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she confessed that maybe she had made a mistake, that perhaps she should have stayed in her lane and let businessmen solve businessmen's problems, because now she was sick, scared, and starting to doubt if all of this would really make any difference in the end. The words hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, and he realized that while he had been agonizing over his reputation and appearances, Maya had literally become ill from trying to do the right thing. Elias left Maya's house with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks, as if a dense fog had finally lifted from his mind. He drove back home under the orange sky of dusk, his hands gripping the steering wheel with renewed determination, and for the first time since discovering Julian's betrayal, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The meeting with the lawyers was scheduled for 2 days away, and Elias decided he would not allow his pride and concern for appearances to destroy not only his company, but also the life of a woman who had risked everything to save him from himself. That night, he didn't sleep, but not out of anxiety or fear. Rather, he was busy planning every detail of the confrontation and every word he would say to Julian when he finally revealed that he knew everything. The next morning, Elias called Julian and asked him to come to the mill earlier than usual, claiming they needed to review some numbers before the lawyers' meeting. The partner agreed with an arrogant confidence that made Elias's stomach churn, and when he hung up the phone, the CEO felt a mix of anger and sadness thinking about how long he had trusted this man. He spent the rest of the day setting the stage for what was about to happen and made a decision that would surprise everyone. Instead of confronting Julian privately or in a courtroom, he would do it at the mill itself, in front of all the employees who had been victims of his schemes. Elias wanted those people to see justice being done, to know their jobs were safe, and to understand that someone had fought for them even when all seemed lost. On the day scheduled for the lawyers' meeting, Elias arrived at the mill at 6 in the morning, an hour before the start of the shift, and asked all employees to gather in the main hall before starting work. The news spread quickly, generating a nervous buzz among the workers who feared this was the meeting where layoffs would be announced. Dolores was among them, her face pale with worry, her arthritic hands clasped in silent prayer. When everyone gathered among the antique looms that had witnessed decades of history, the silence that fell over the hall was heavy with fear and expectation. Julian arrived minutes later, surprised to find the entire team gathered, and looked at Elias with a confused expression that quickly turned suspicious when he saw the wooden box on the makeshift table in the center of the hall. Elias began to speak in a voice that echoed off the brick walls, telling them about the irregularities he had discovered, about the shell companies and the systematic embezzlement that had been bleeding the company for almost a year. He showed documents, read excerpts from emails, and presented numbers that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the mill's financial crisis was not the result of a lack of modernization or excessive personnel costs, but rather calculated and premeditated theft. The employees listened in growing shock, murmurs of indignation spreading through the crowd. Julian stood motionless, his face cycling through emotions ranging from surprise to anger to something that looked like genuine fear. The partner tried to interrupt several times, claiming this was a ridiculous misunderstanding, but Elias continued relentlessly. When he finally played the audio recording where Julian discussed the schemes with his accomplice, the silence that took over the hall was absolute. Julian's voice coming from the old cell phone speakers was too clear to deny, every word a confession that sealed his fate. He spoke about specific amounts embezzled, about how close he was to getting the entire company for a fraction of the price, about how Elias was too stupid to realize what was happening right under his nose. The employees listened with a mix of horror and fascination, and Dolores covered her mouth with her hands when she casually heard Julian mention that the long-tenured workers would be the first to be discarded once he assumed full control. When the recording ended, Elias offered Julian a choice that surprised everyone. He could return all the embezzled money, leave the partnership peacefully, and avoid a criminal prosecution that would destroy not only his career, but also his family. Or he could refuse and face the full legal consequences of his actions. Julian looked around the hall, seeing the faces of the people he had betrayed, and something in him seemed to break. He accepted the terms in a low, defeated voice, but before leaving, he couldn't contain his venomous nature. With his eyes fixed on Elias, he spat out words charged with contempt about how the CEO had stooped to trusting a simple chef instead of hiring real professionals, about how this proved his weakness and incompetence as a business leader. The words echoed through the hall and hit Elias like poisoned arrows, not because they wounded his pride, but because they revealed how much he himself had thought the exact same thing only weeks earlier, how much he too had viewed Maya as inferior because of her social position. Shame burned Elias's face as Julian walked out, and when he looked at the gathered employees, he saw a silent question in Dolores's eyes that he knew he needed to answer. It was there in front of all those workers that Elias did something he never imagined doing. He told the complete truth. She tried to sit up, but he motioned for her to stay put, and he sat in the wooden chair next to the sofa, feeling out of place in the simple yet warm environment that sharply contrasted with the empty luxury of his own home. They talked for almost an hour, and Maya, weakened by sickness and medication, revealed things she would never have had the courage to say under normal circumstances. She spoke about how many times she had almost given up the investigation, about the nights she cried in fear of being discovered, about the guilt she felt for hiding everything from her mother. Dolores, who noticed her exhaustion but didn't understand the cause. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she confessed that maybe she had made a mistake, that perhaps she should have stayed in her lane and let businessmen solve businessmen's problems, because now she was sick, scared, and beginning to doubt if all of this would really make any difference in the end. The words struck Elias with the force of a slap, and he realized that while he had been agonizing over his reputation and appearances, Maya had literally fallen ill from trying to do the right thing. Elias left Maya's house with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks, as if a dense fog had finally lifted from his mind. He drove back home under the deep orange sky of twilight, his hands gripping the steering wheel with renewed determination. And for the first time since discovering Julian's betrayal, he knew exactly what he needed to do. He explained how Maya had been the first to suspect the irregularities, how she had spent months investigating on her own, sacrificing sleep and her own health to gather the evidence that had just saved not only the company, but the jobs of everyone in that hall. Elias revealed that the chef was sick at home at that very moment, suffering from nervous gastritis caused by the stress of carrying that secret alone, and that if it weren't for her courage and intelligence, everyone would have been about to lose everything without ever knowing the real reason. The revelation was met with stunned silence, and then Dolores began to weep, not from sadness, but from an intense pride that made her tremble. Other employees joined her, some crying, others applauding, and Elias felt tears sting his own eyes for the first time in decades. The days that followed were a chaotic mix of meetings with lawyers, financial audits, and company reorganization. Julian fulfilled his part of the agreement, returning the embezzled money through carefully documented transfers, and signed his exit from the partnership in a tense meeting where he barely looked at Elias. The news of what had happened spread through Kingsporters like wildfire, and Elias began to face exactly the kind of comments he had feared. Businessmen at the country clubs making jokes about him needing his chef to solve his problems, veiled insinuations about his competence and looks of pity or poorly disguised amusement at social events. But something had profoundly changed within the CEO, and for the first time in his life, he discovered that he simply didn't care what those people thought, that their approval wasn't worth the suffering of those who truly mattered. Maya took almost 2 weeks to recover enough to return to work, and when she finally appeared at the door of Elias's kitchen one November morning, she looked smaller, more fragile, her eyes still ringed by dark shadows that told the story of everything she had endured. Elias was in the kitchen trying and miserably failing to make pancakes, and when he saw Maya, he dropped the spatula into the sink and simply stood there, unsure what to say. The chef gave a small, tired smile, commenting that it seemed he still needed her after all, and the attempt at humor broke the tension between them. They sat at the table, and Elias recounted everything that had happened during her absence, the confrontation with Julian, how he had publicly revealed her role in saving the company, and the return of the money that had secured not only the mill's survival, but also the jobs of dozens of families. But Maya didn't look relieved or happy with the news as Elias had expected. Instead, she confessed that she had been struggling with feelings of inadequacy that consumed her since she fell ill, constantly questioning whether she had made the right choice, whether she shouldn't have stayed in her place and let things take their natural course. The chef spoke about comments she had heard from acquaintances who worked in other homes around town, about how she was being viewed as someone who had meddled where she shouldn't, who had crossed boundaries she shouldn't have. She mentioned that some businessmen who used to greet her cordially when they saw her at the market now avoided her or cast disapproving glances, and she had begun to doubt if the price she paid for doing the right thing hadn't been too high. The words spilled out in an emotional torrent she couldn't contain, and Elias listened in silence, feeling his heart tighten as he realized that while he struggled with his own wounded pride, Maya was facing an even tougher battle against the prejudice and disapproval of a society that didn't tolerate people like her, daring to step outside their predefined roles. Elias made a decision in that moment that would change not only the dynamic between him and Maya, but the entire structure of the company. He announced he was creating an advisory board composed of employee representatives, a group that would have an active voice in decisions affecting the workers' well-being and the preservation of the traditional weaving techniques that made their products unique. Dolores would be one of the representatives, along with other veteran weavers, and Maya, despite not working directly at the mill, would be invited to participate in meetings whenever administrative issues were discussed. More importantly, Elias adjusted Maya's salary to reflect not only her work as a chef, but also her value as someone whose insight and courage had saved the company. A raise she initially tried to refuse until he explained that it was not a favor or charity, but deserved recognition for work accomplished. The mill slowly began to recover financially over the following months, but the process was painful and full of obstacles that tested the determination of everyone involved. Julian's embezzlement had left real debts with legitimate suppliers that needed to be paid, and Elias had to renegotiate contracts, cut costs in other areas, and work more hours than ever before to keep the company running while restoring financial health. He implemented changes gradually, modernizing some processes without eliminating the traditional weavers, finding a balance between efficiency and cultural preservation that benefited both profitability and the workers. The advisory board meetings took place weekly, and Elias discovered that listening to the perspectives of those who actually performed the daily work brought valuable insights he never would have considered alone. But not everything was victory and progress. Maya continued to face the veiled prejudice of other businessmen and members of the Kingsport elite who saw her as someone who didn't know her place. There were dinners at friends' houses where she was invited as a chef, but later discovered people commenting on her involvement in the mill's decisions with mockery or disapproval. There was one particularly painful occasion when she overheard, unintentionally, two businessmen's wives discussing how Elias had lost his mind by listening to a simple housekeeper, cook, and how this proved he was no longer capable of leading a serious business. The words wounded her deeply, reopening scars she thought were beginning to heal, and she came home that night crying silently while preparing dinner, questioning once more if she had made the right choice. Elias noticed the change in Maya's behavior, the way she withdrew into herself, how she avoided making comments or suggestions even during the advisory board meetings. When he finally managed to get her to confess what was happening, he felt a burning anger toward the people he used to call friends. The CEO made another decision that surprised everyone. At an important charity gala for the local elite, an event held annually at the most exclusive country club in Kingsport, he brought Maya not as his chef, but as his guest of honor, introducing her to everyone as the woman who had saved his company and dozens of families with her intelligence and courage. The reaction was mixed, with some showing genuine admiration and others barely concealing their contempt. But Elias stayed by Maya's side all night, making it clear that any disrespect toward her would be considered disrespect toward himself. The relationship between Elias and Maya evolved over those months in a way neither of them expected. They developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and deep understanding, talking not just about work, but about life, dreams, fears, and regrets. Elias learned to listen more and speak less, to consider perspectives he had previously ignored completely, and Maya gradually gained the confidence to express her opinions without fear of reprisal or judgment. They shared morning coffees where they discussed everything from philosophy to culinary recipes, and the CEO discovered a wealth of knowledge and wisdom in someone society considered inferior simply because of her economic standing. Maya, in turn, learned to value her own capabilities in ways she never had before, understanding that intelligence and worth were not tied to diplomas or social status, but to character, effort, and the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. But challenges continued to arrive in unexpected ways. In December, an article appeared in the local newspaper about the change in the mill's direction, briefly mentioning Maya's role in exposing Julian's embezzlement. The article, although factual, generated a wave of social media comments ranging from admiration to cruel scorn, with some people praising the chef's courage and others making jokes about housekeepers who didn't know their place. Maya read the comments obsessively, each negative word cutting deeper than the last. Dolores found her one night crying over her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's blue light. Her mother took the phone from her hands and hugged her daughter as she broke down, releasing months of accumulated tension. It was Dolores who finally said the words Maya needed to hear, that people who never had to fight for anything would never understand the value of the struggle, and that their opinion didn't matter one bit compared to the good she had done. Note: the original text contained a meta-commentary break typical of online narratives. This has been noted and the narrative flow resumed. Returning to the story. Christmas arrived in Kingsport, bringing with it the crisp winter air and an atmosphere of renewal that seemed to permeate every corner of the town. The streets filled with colorful decorations, and the traditional midnight mass at the main church was already scheduled, but for Elias and Maya, the festive season brought more reflection than celebration. The CEO had made a decision that had been maturing in his mind for weeks. He would organize a Christmas Eve dinner at the mill for all employees and their families, a gesture that went beyond simple socializing and represented a public acknowledgement of the value of every person working there. Maya would be responsible for preparing the dinner, but this time not alone and hidden in the kitchen, but coordinating a team where she would have a visible voice and presence throughout the celebration. The preparation for the dinner consumed the first weeks of December, and Maya divided her time between planning the menu and dealing with her own insecurities that continued to haunt her like persistent shadows. She spent hours in the kitchen testing recipes, aiming to create dishes that honored the regional traditions that were part of that community's identity, while simultaneously fighting the inner voice that whispered she didn't deserve to be in that position, that she was just a chef who had been lucky. Elias noticed her internal conflict and tried to offer support, but he also understood that there were battles Maya needed to win alone, internal journeys that no words of encouragement could shorten. He focused on ensuring the mill continued its financial recovery, working long hours to renegotiate contracts and establish new business relationships to offset the losses caused by Julian's embezzlement. In mid-December, an unexpected event brought new complications to the already delicate situation. An old client of the mill, an influential businessman from Biwa, Charlotte, named Virgil Sampson, called Elias questioning the rumors he had heard about administrative changes and the involvement of a chef in business matters. The conversation was tense, with Virgil insinuating that he wasn't comfortable doing business with a company making decisions based on the advice of employees without business qualifications, and suggesting it might be time to reconsider the commercial partnership they had maintained for over a decade. Elias felt anger boil in his veins, but he kept his voice controlled as he explained that the changes had saved the company from a fraud that would have destroyed everything, and that anyone who couldn't see the value in that wasn't the kind of partner he wanted to have. Virgil hung up without committing to continuing business, and Elias stood holding the dead phone, realizing that the consequences of his choices would continue to unfold in unpredictable ways. The potential loss of a major client shook Elias's confidence in ways he didn't expect. The CEO began to question if he had been reckless in publicly exposing the details of what had happened, if he shouldn't have resolved everything discreetly to avoid exactly this kind of repercussion. He spent nights awake doing calculations, trying to determine how much the company could lose if other clients followed Virgil's example, and the weight of the responsibility for all those jobs that depended on him began to crush his shoulders again. Maya noticed the change in his behavior, the way he had become distant again during meals, and one night, after he barely touched the dinner she had prepared, the chef confronted him directly, demanding to know what was happening. Elias hesitated, not wanting to burden her with more worries, but she insisted with a firmness he had learned to respect. He finally told her about Virgil's call and his fears about losing more clients. Maya's reaction completely surprised Elias. Instead of blaming herself or offering to step away from company decisions, she looked him directly in the eye and said that if some clients couldn't see past social prejudices, then the mill was probably better off without them, and that building a business based on hiding the truth or appeasing small-minded people wasn't sustainable in the long run. The words came with a conviction that sharply contrasted with the insecurity she had shown weeks earlier. And Elias realized that Maya was undergoing her own transformation, finding strength in places she didn't even know existed. They talked late into the night, not just about business, but about values, about what kind of legacy they wanted to leave, and for the first time since Virgil's call, Elias felt the anxiety in his chest loosen a bit. The days leading up to Christmas Eve dinner were marked by small victories that helped balance the larger concerns. Dolores brought news that the employees were working with renewed enthusiasm, knowing their jobs were safe and their voices were being heard through the advisory board. 3 new smaller clients approached the mill, drawn precisely by the story of integrity and transformation that had spread throughout the region. Although the contracts didn't completely offset the potential loss of Virgil, they represented a promising start. Elias began to see that perhaps there was a market for products made by a company that valued people as much as profits, and the idea began to form in his mind to reposition the mill's brand, not just for its artisanal fabrics, but for the human story behind them. Maya, meanwhile, faced her own challenges in preparing the dinner. She had decided to include 3 employees' wives who had always shown interest in cooking in the kitchen team, turning the event into a community effort rather than an individual show. The decision was both practical and symbolic, a way to distribute the work and also to demonstrate that valuing people meant creating opportunities for them to shine. But working in a team proved more difficult than Maya had anticipated, as she had always worked alone and struggled to delegate tasks or accept suggestions that differed from her original ideas. There were moments of tension in the kitchen, arguments over spices and techniques, and Maya needed to learn to balance her vision with the contributions of others, a lesson in humility that mirrored Elias's journey in learning to listen to the employees. A week before Christmas, another twist shook the fragile stability they were building. Julian, who had disappeared from Kingsport after the confrontation at the mill, resurfaced with a lawsuit claiming he had been coerced into signing his exit from the partnership under emotional distress and that the agreement should be voided. The lawsuit was clearly a desperate attempt to regain some power or cause trouble, but it still represented a real threat that demanded attention and resources. Elias consulted his lawyers, who assured him the case had no solid foundation given all the documented evidence, but the process itself would be long, expensive, and publicly draining. The CEO felt the familiar sensation of being pulled backward every time he tried to move forward, as if the universe was testing his resolve to see how far he was truly willing to go. The news of the lawsuit reached Maya through Dolores, who had heard it discussed among the worried employees at the mill. The chef felt the old fear tighten her chest, the insidious voice of doubt whispering that this was all her fault, that if she had stayed quiet in her place, none of this would be happening. She spent the afternoon locked in her room, ignoring her mother's worried knocks on the door, fighting the temptation to simply give up everything and return to the safe invisibility of being just a chef whom nobody noticed or judged. It was only when Elias appeared at her house at the end of the day, worried because she hadn't answered his messages, that Maya finally opened the door and let all the anguish overflow in tears that seemed endless. Elias held Maya's hands as she cried, and when the sobs finally subsided, he shared something he had never told anyone. He revealed that years ago, when he started at the mill as a young businessman inheriting the business from his father, he had almost lost everything by making decisions based only on appearances and status, ignoring the advice of experienced employees because he thought he knew better due to having a college degree. Only the intervention of an old weaver who dared to confront him had saved the company from bankruptcy back then, and Elias had spent decades trying to forget that lesson in humility because it was easier to pretend he always knew what he was doing. He confessed that what Julian had said about him stooping to trust a chef had hurt so much because it touched on his greatest fear, that without the diplomas and the status, he was worth nothing, and that he constantly needed to prove his worth through appearances rather than substance. Elias's vulnerability created a moment of deep connection between them, and Maya realized she wasn't alone in her insecurities, that even people who seemed confident and in control struggled with doubts and fears. They rarely showed the world. They talked for hours, sharing stories of failures and shame they had never told anyone, and when Maya finally smiled again, it was a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. Elias suggested they face Julian's lawsuit the same way they had faced everything so far, with truth, evidence, and the certainty that they were on the right side of history, and Maya agreed, feeling a renewed determination ignite in her chest. The week before Christmas passed in a whirlwind of final preparations and small everyday miracles. Virgil Sampson called again, this time to apologize and say he had reconsidered his position after talking to other businessmen who praised Elias's demonstrated integrity. The client not only maintained the existing contract, but proposed expanding it, impressed by how the mill had handled the crisis. The news arrived at the perfect moment, lifting the spirits of the entire team and proving that doing the right thing didn't always result in losses. Sometimes it attracted exactly the right kind of people. Maya and her kitchen team finalized the dinner menu, finding a harmonious balance between their different visions, and the preparations took shape in a way that exceeded initial expectations. But even amidst the festive preparations, Maya continued to face moments of doubt that arose unexpectedly. There was one afternoon when she was at the market buying ingredients and overheard two women commenting on the mill dinner, one of them laughing, as she said it was typical for housekeepers to want to stand out more than they should. The words hit her like a slap, and she had to stop herself from dropping everything and running out. But then she thought of her mother, Dolores, working at the looms for 40 years, of all the employees whose jobs had been saved, of Elias learning to be a better leader, and she decided that the opinion of prejudiced strangers was no longer worth a second of her time or emotional energy. She finished her shopping with her head held high, and when she left the market, she felt an inch taller than when she had entered. Christmas Eve dawned with a bright blue sky, and the mill was transformed for the occasion. The looms were covered with festive fabrics, long tables were set up in the main hall, and artisanal decorations made by the employees themselves hung from the ceiling, creating a welcoming atmosphere that smelled of hope and new beginnings. Maya arrived early with her kitchen team, and together they began the final work of preparing the feast that would feed more than 100 people. The pace in the kitchen was intense but harmonious, each woman contributing her unique skills, and for the first time since starting this journey, Maya felt she wasn't carrying the weight alone, that there were others willing to share both the work and the responsibility. The employees began arriving at the mill in the late afternoon, bringing children dressed in Sunday best and an air of expectation that transformed the industrial environment into something almost magical. Dolores was one of the first to enter, and when she saw Maya coordinating the finishing touches on the dishes in the makeshift kitchen, her eyes filled with tears of pride that she tried to hide by turning her face away. Mother and daughter exchanged a look laden with meaning, communicating without words everything they had gone through together to reach that moment. And Maya felt a wave of emotion threaten to break her, but she took a deep breath and returned to work because there was still much to do. Elias circulated among the guests with a lightness he hadn't shown in months, greeting each family by name, stopping to talk to the children running between the tables, and there was something different in his demeanor, an authenticity that had replaced the formal stiffness that had always characterized him at social events. When everyone finally sat down at the tables, the hall was filled with animated conversations and laughter that echoed off the brick walls. Maya and her team began serving the dishes, and the chef watched the faces of the people as they tasted the food she had prepared with such care, seeing genuine satisfaction in every expression of approval. But the most significant moment was yet to come, and when Elias stood up and asked for attention, the silence that fell over the hall was heavy with expectation. The CEO began to speak in a voice that trembled slightly with emotion, thanking everyone for remaining faithful to the mill during the difficult times, acknowledging the work and dedication of every person present. He spoke about the challenges they had faced, about the betrayal that had almost destroyed everything, and then, with eyes shining with unshed tears, he began to tell the story of how they were saved. Elias spared no detail in narrating how Maya had been the first to suspect the irregularities, how she had spent months investigating alone, sacrificing her health and peace of mind to gather the evidence that saved not only the company, but the jobs of every family present in that hall. He spoke about finding her crying in the storage room surrounded by documents, about how he had initially questioned her involvement, driven by prejudices that now deeply shamed him, and about how she had persisted even when she fell ill from stress. The audience listened in absolute silence, some people covering their mouths in shock, others with tears streaming freely down their faces, and Maya felt her face burn as all eyes turned toward her. The CEO continued, his voice growing firmer as he spoke, and then he said something no one expected. He confessed that Maya had not only saved the company, but she had saved him from his own arrogance and blindness, teaching him that worth had nothing to do with diplomas or social position, but with character, courage, and integrity. When Elias finished speaking, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the room exploded in applause that seemed endless. People stood up, clapping with an intensity that made the tables shake, and Maya remained standing where she was, completely paralyzed by the emotion that choked her. Dolores was the first to reach her, hugging her daughter so tightly that they almost fell, and soon others joined in, creating a circle of hugs and thanks that left Maya simultaneously embarrassed and deeply moved. She tried to say that she had only done what any decent person would have done, but her voice was lost in the noise of the celebrations, and for the first time since starting this journey, she allowed herself to truly believe that maybe, just maybe, she had done something worth all the suffering. The dinner continued in an atmosphere of genuine joy, but for Maya, something fundamental had changed in that moment of public recognition. She no longer felt like someone who needed to prove her worth or apologize for existing, and when she returned to the kitchen to supervise dessert, there was a lightness in her steps that hadn't been there before. The other women on the team hugged her, whispering words of admiration and gratitude, and Maya realized she had created something beyond a simple dinner. She had built connections that would transform those women into friends and allies. The rest of the night passed in a blur of conversations, impromptu music with guitars someone had brought, and children running between the tables as the adults shared stories and plans for the mill's future. But the peace of that night would be tested in the days that followed. Julian's lawsuit gained traction when he secured a lawyer known for controversial cases, and the process began to receive local media attention. Reporters started calling the mill asking for interviews, and some published articles presented the situation in a distorted manner, painting Julian as a victim of conspiracy and Elias as an incompetent businessman who allowed himself to be manipulated by employees. The false narrative spread faster than the truth, and Myatt watched with growing horror as the story was being rewritten by people who cared nothing for facts, only for sensationalism. She faced more judgmental stares when she went out, more malicious comments whispered in her direction, and the chef felt the old fear begin to creep back, threatening to undo all the progress she had made. Elias was equally shaken by the media coverage, but now he had a different perspective on what truly mattered. He consulted his lawyers on how to respond, and they suggested a press conference where he could present the facts clearly and unequivocally. But the CEO hesitated, knowing that any additional public exposure would put Maya even more under the spotlight that she clearly found uncomfortable. It was she who made the decision, appearing in his office one January morning with a determination he immediately recognized. Maya said that hiding from the truth wouldn't make the problems disappear, and if they needed to face the media to correct the lies, then that's what they would do together, because she had learned that running from difficulties only made them grow in the shadows. The press conference was scheduled for a week later, and the days leading up to the event were the most stressful either of them had experienced. Elias and Maya spent hours rehearsing what they would say, reviewing documents to ensure every statement could be proven, and dealing with the anxiety that threatened to paralyze them every time they thought about standing before cameras and answering hostile questions. Dolores supported her daughter the best she could, preparing calming teas and offering words of encouragement, but even she was worried about the exposure Maya would face. The mill continued operating, but there was a tension in the air that everyone felt, a sense that they were all holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. On the day of the conference, the City Hall conference room was packed with reporters, cameras, and onlookers who wanted to witness the unfolding of the story that had captured the city's attention. Elias and Maya walked in together. She wore a simple but elegant suit that Dolores had helped her choose. He wore a formal suit, but without the tie he would normally use, a small gesture of distancing himself from the rigid appearances that had always characterized him. The questions began immediately, some genuinely curious, others clearly hostile, and Elias answered methodically, presenting documented evidence for every claim he made. When asked about Maya's role, he did not minimize or try to soften it. He simply told the plain, direct truth of how she had saved the company and all its jobs through extraordinary courage and intelligence. But it was when a reporter asked Maya directly if she didn't think she had overstepped boundaries by getting involved in business matters, being just a chef, that the decisive moment occurred. Maya was silent for long seconds, feeling all eyes fixed on her, and then began to speak in a voice that started shaky but gained strength as she continued. She spoke about her mother working 40 years at the looms, about all the families who depended on that mill to survive, and about how she couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen without at least trying to do something. The chef said she didn't care what people thought about her crossing boundaries, because those boundaries were artificial constructs created to keep some people in power and others in invisibility, and that if doing the right thing meant breaking those unjust rules, then she would break them again without hesitation. The words came out with a passion that surprised even herself, and when she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. The interview was news on all local channels that night, but this time the narrative was different. Several journalists highlighted Maya's courage and Elias's transformation, and while there were still negative comments, they were largely outweighed by messages of support and admiration. People who had never contacted the mill began sending emails praising the demonstrated integrity, and some even placed product orders specifically because they wanted to support a company with those values. Maya read the messages with tears in her eyes, not of sadness but of a relief so profound it hurt, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe the world wasn't as relentlessly cruel as it had seemed in recent months. But the legal battle with Julian still continued, and 2 weeks after the interview, there was a preliminary hearing where both sides presented their initial arguments. Elias was prepared with mountains of documented evidence, witnesses willing to confirm every detail, and the confidence of someone who knew they were on the right side of history. Julian, on the other hand, presented a case based mainly on emotional allegations of coercion without concrete evidence to support them. The judge listened to both sides with a neutral expression that revealed none of his thoughts, and at the end of the hearing scheduled a decision for 1 month later, leaving everyone in suspense about the final outcome. The month of waiting was torturous in different ways for each of them. Elias kept busy with work at the mill, implementing the changes the advisory board suggested and seeing positive results that reinforced his decision to give employees a voice. Maya returned to her cooking routine, but now with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her work was valued not only for her culinary skills, but for who she was as a person. She still faced occasional negative comments or judgmental looks, but she had learned to let them slide without attachment, focusing instead on the people who truly mattered and who supported her unconditionally. It was during this month of waiting that something unexpected happened, a small twist that no one had anticipated. A young college student from Charlotte, doing research on women who broke social barriers, reached out asking to interview Maya for her senior thesis. Maya initially refused, uncomfortable with more attention, but Elias encouraged her to accept, arguing that her story could inspire other women in similar situations. Maya finally agreed, and the interview ended up being a cathartic experience, where she could process everything that had happened through the structured narrative of telling her journey to an outsider. The student was visibly moved hearing the story, and when she left, she hugged Maya and said she was exactly the kind of example the world needed to see more of. When the day of the court decision finally arrived, Elias and Maya went to the courthouse together, accompanied by Dolores and several mill employees who insisted on showing support. The courtroom was packed, and when the judge entered and began reading his decision, the silence was so dense that every breath seemed to echo. The magistrate was methodical in his analysis, deconstructing every one of Julian's arguments with relentless logic, and concluded that there was no evidence of coercion or undue pressure, only a guilty man trying to escape the consequences of his actions through legal manipulation. The case was definitively closed in Elias's favor, and Julian would be further investigated by the competent authorities for the documented embezzlement. When the gavel struck, ending the session, tears of relief streamed down Maya and Dolores's faces, and Elias felt a weight he had carried for months finally lift from his shoulders. The months following the judicial victory brought a profound transformation not only to the mill, but to the entire Kingsporters community that had witnessed the journey. Elias implemented the structural changes he had been planning, formalizing the advisory board as a permanent part of the company's governance, and the results exceeded all expectations. Productivity increased because the workers felt valued and heard, the quality of the fabrics improved, because the traditional weavers shared ancient techniques that were being lost, and new clients continued to arrive, attracted by the story of integrity that now defined the brand. The mill not only recovered financially, but began to prosper in ways it never had under the previous management, proving that profit and humanity were not mutually exclusive, as so many businessmen insisted on believing. Maya continued as Elias's chef, but her role had organically expanded to include active participation in decisions affecting the employees' well-being. She held no formal title beyond her kitchen work and didn't want one, satisfied to contribute without needing official recognition that would only fuel more comments about her not knowing her place. The chef had developed a thicker skin against external judgments, learning to distinguish between criticism that deserved attention and insignificant noise from small-minded people trying to feel big by diminishing others. She still faced occasional moments of doubt, still had days where insecurity haunted her, but now she had emotional tools and a support network that helped her weather those storms without being destroyed by them. Dolores, seeing her daughter's transformation, experienced her own silent awakening. The woman who had spent 40 years working in silence at the looms began to speak more in the board meetings, bringing perspectives that only decades of experience could provide, and her voice carried a weight that the other members learned to deeply respect. She and Maya developed an even closer relationship, now not just as mother and daughter, but as allies in a social transformation that went beyond their individual lives. They spent Sunday afternoons together, drinking coffee and talking about everything from recipes to philosophy, and these moments became sacred for both of them, a refuge of peace in a world that constantly demanded more than they sometimes felt they had to give. Maya's story eventually reached beyond Kingsport, thanks to the senior thesis of that college student who interviewed her. The research was published in an academic journal on social studies, and although it had limited circulation, it reached the hands of influential people who began using the case as an example in discussions about class barriers and the unrecognized value of domestic work. Maya received invitations to give talks, which she always refused, uncomfortable with the idea of being turned into a symbol or inspiration, preferring simply to live her life and do her job without the added pressure of representing something bigger. Elias respected this choice, understanding that not everyone wanted or needed the spotlight to validate their contributions, and that sometimes the greatest impact came precisely from remaining authentic instead of turning into something others expected. But there was one specific occasion where Maya broke her rule about speaking publicly, and it was a moment that would change lives in ways she never anticipated. A local high school invited her to speak to a group of adolescent girls from working-class families about possibilities beyond the traditional paths society expected of them. The chef almost automatically refused, but something in the letter from the inviting teacher touched her, a sincerity that spoke of bright students who didn't believe they had worth because their families were poor or because they worked in service jobs. Maya accepted, and on the afternoon she walked into that classroom with 20 pairs of young eyes fixed on her. She felt a fear more intense than she had felt at any other point in her journey. She didn't give a rehearsed or inspiring speech. She simply told her story honestly, including the difficult parts, the moments of doubt, the times she almost gave up. Maya spoke about working as a chef not being a source of shame, about how domestic skills that society undervalued were actually evidence of competence and dedication. She told them about investigating the embezzlement at the mill, about falling ill from stress, about facing prejudice and judgment, but also about finding strength in unexpected places and discovering that her worth was not defined by the opinions of others. The girls listened in reverent silence, and when Maya finished, one of them raised her hand and asked in a trembling voice how she learned to believe in herself when everyone told her she wasn't good enough. The question struck Maya straight to the heart because she recognized her own struggle in those words. The answer Maya gave in that moment came from a place of absolute truth she didn't even know she possessed. She said she never truly learned to believe in herself constantly, that she still struggled with doubt every day, but she had discovered something more important. She didn't need unwavering confidence to do the right thing. She only needed enough courage to take the next step, even when afraid. She explained that self-belief didn't come before the action, but grew gradually through small acts of courage that accumulated until one day she looked back and realized how far she had walked. The words resonated in the room in a visceral way, several girls with tears in their eyes, and when Maya left that school an hour later, she knew that conversation had been as important as everything she had done to save the mill, perhaps even more important because it had planted seeds in young soils where they could grow for decades. Elias, for his part, faced his own continuous transformations that constantly tested his newly discovered values. There was a proposal from a national retail chain to buy large quantities of fabrics, but only if he automated production and cut costs by eliminating the traditional weavers. The contract would represent huge profits, the kind of financial success that previously would have intensely tempted him. But when he presented the proposal to the advisory board and saw the faces of the workers who trusted him, the decision was surprisingly easy. Elias refused the contract, explaining to the retail chain that the artisanal quality and the jobs of the people who created that quality were non-negotiable, and if that meant growing slower, then it was a price worth paying. The decision cost him some sarcastic comments from other businessmen about him having gone soft, but he slept better that night than he had in years. The relationship between Elias and Maya had evolved into something that transcended simple categories of employer and employee, or even friends. They became mutual confidants, people who shared a transformative experience that linked them in ways few relationships achieve. There was no romance between them, never was and never would be, but there was a deep respect and genuine affection that manifested in small daily gestures. Elias asking about Dolores's arthritis and offering to help with medical expenses without making it seem like charity. Maya noticing when he was stressed and preparing the dishes, she knew comforted him without him having to ask. They learned each other's unspoken language, developing a synergy that came from genuinely caring about the other person's well-being without expectations or hidden agendas. Mid-year, the mill celebrated its centennial with an event that brought together past and present workers, clients, suppliers, and community members. It was a celebration that honored both the history and the future of the company, and Elias made sure that the true heroes of that story were recognized. Dolores received a special tribute for her 40 years of service, and when she walked onto the small stage set up in the main hall, her arthritic but steady hands holding a plaque of recognition, her eyes shone with tears of happiness. Other veteran weavers were similarly honored, their stories told with the respect they deserved, and the celebration became less about the company itself and more about the people who made it exist through decades of dedicated work. Maya watched everything from a discreet corner, refusing to be publicly highlighted despite Elias's requests, satisfied to witness the joy of others without needing to be the center of attention. But there was one moment during the party when Elias found her and pulled her aside to a quieter corner, away from the celebrating crowd. He held her hands, something he had never done before, and with moist eyes he said something he had been rehearsing in his mind for weeks, that she had not only saved his company, but she had saved him from becoming the kind of man who would have lived an entire life without ever truly living, chasing appearances and status while losing what truly mattered. Elias confessed that he constantly thought about how his life might have been if Maya hadn't had the courage to get involved, and that the gratitude he felt went far beyond words or gestures he could offer. Maya listened in silence, and when he finished, she said something Elias would never forget. The chef explained that she didn't do any of it for him specifically, but for people like her mother, who dedicated their entire lives to jobs that society undervalued, and that if she saved Elias in the process, it was because he chose to be saved. He chose to change instead of clinging to pride and old ways. She said that true transformation always came from within, that she had only offered information and support, but he had done the difficult work of questioning everything he had always believed about worth and merit. The words were spoken with a wisdom that came not from books or formal education, but from living authentically and paying attention to the lessons life offered, and Elias realized he was standing before someone who was infinitely wiser than he would be even living 2 lifetimes. The final months of that transformative year brought small joys that accumulated into a general feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, the world could be a slightly fairer place when people chose to do the right thing, even when it was hard. The mill continued to prosper in modest but sustainable ways. New workers were hired and trained by the veterans in techniques that were almost lost, and the Sagyung, Kingsport community began to see the business as an example that prosperity didn't have to come at the expense of humanity. Maya had returned to sleeping well most nights, the dark circles that had marked her face for so long finally disappearing, and Dolores noticed with silent joy how her daughter walked with her head held a little higher than before. In December, exactly 1 year after that first transformative Christmas Eve dinner, they gathered again to celebrate. The atmosphere was different this time, marked not by tension or anxiety about the future, but by a quiet gratitude for the present and a realistic hope for what was to come. When Elias stood up to give the annual toast, he didn't speak about profits or business achievements, but about people and the human connections that made everything more meaningful. He thanked Maya again, but this time differently, acknowledging not only what she had done but who she was, a woman of extraordinary courage who chose to act when it would have been easier to remain silent, and who, by making that choice, had not only changed individual lives, but had planted seeds of transformation that would continue to grow for generations. Maya, this time, did not hide in the corners. She remained visible among the guests, accepting hugs and thanks with a grace that came from finally believing she deserved recognition as much as anyone else. When the night ended and the last guests left, she stayed to help clean up with Dolores, and they worked in a comfortable silence that needed no words. The mother looked at her daughter and saw in her not just the girl she had raised, but a woman who had found her strength through trials that would have broken less resilient people, and the pride Dolores felt was so intense it ached sweetly in her chest. In the years that followed, the story of Maya and Elias would be told and retold in Kingsport, becoming part of the local folklore that parents shared with their children as a lesson about courage and integrity. But for those who lived the experience directly, it was not a story with a conventional happy ending, because life continued with its challenges and complexities that didn't magically disappear. Maya still faced occasional prejudiced comments, still wrestled with moments of doubt, still needed to prove her worth to people who refused to see beyond her position as a chef. Elias still made mistakes, still occasionally fell into old patterns of thinking in terms of status, still needed to consciously remind himself to value people over appearances. But what had fundamentally changed was that now both of them had tools, perspectives, and a support network that helped them navigate difficulties without being destroyed by them. They learned that transformation was not a destination reached, but a continuous process of daily choices, of repeatedly deciding to be better even when it was easier to revert to what was familiar. The mill prospered not because problems disappeared, but because dedicated people were working together to solve them, in ways that honored both efficiency and humanity. And perhaps more importantly, they proved that it was possible to build success without sacrificing integrity, that profit and compassion were not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the least expected person could be exactly who you needed to save you not just from external circumstances, but from your own limitations and blindness. Maya continued to be a chef because she loved the work, not because it was all she could be, and that distinction made all the difference. Elias continued to be a businessman, but now one who understood that true leadership meant serving those you led, not dominating them. And together, without intending to start a movement or change the world, they demonstrated through simple actions and consistent choices that an ordinary person doing the right thing could have an impact that would echo far beyond their own life, touching other lives that would touch still others, creating ripples of change that started small but expanded in ever-widening circles. When Maya looked back on that journey that began with muffled cries in a storage room and sleepless nights investigating documents, she didn't see grandiose heroism or dramatic transformation, but rather a series of small decisions to keep going even when afraid, to do what was right even when it cost her dearly, to believe it was worth trying even when success seemed unlikely. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that real change rarely came from grand gestures or singular moments of glory, but from the accumulated courage of thousands of small acts of integrity that eventually added up to something greater than their individual parts. And that truth, simple yet profound, was the legacy that Maya and Elias would leave for everyone who witnessed their journey, a living proof that ordinary people doing the right things could, indeed, change not just their own lives, but the world around them, one courageous step at a time.